I'm Menachem Learfield, and this is Dear Rabbi, where we answer your questions about Judaism. This week on Dear Rabbi. In the Torah, it states that one is prohibited to add or subtract from the mitzvos. How then do the rabbinic mitzvos come to be? Good question. So you're correct. The Torah forbids us from adding or detracting from the Torah, and both adding and detracting are equally problematic. And your question is such a good one that the Ramban, Nachmanides, asks the question himself. He asks, how do the rabbis make fences for the Torah? Isn't that adding to it? And he explains, which in turn answers your question as well, that there's a distinction between a rabbinic mitzvah and adding to the Torah. Adding to the Torah would be if I would come along and say that this is what the Torah says when the Torah doesn't say it. Rabbinic mitzvos, on the other hand, are very different. There, the rabbis are, as the Torah actually commands them to do, putting up protective fences lest a person transgress and actually do something that is forbidden by Torah law. But when we do those, we understand that there's a distinction between rabbinic law and Torah law. And as long as we understand the distinctions and we understand that these are put in place to protect us from transgressing biblical Torah law, it's all A-okay, not only kosher, but actually it is required by the Torah itself. Kind of like you'd have a guardrail on the side of the highway, you'd have a wall or a fence on top of a very high roof. If we take Torah seriously and we want to make sure that we don't transgress biblical law, we need to have those guardrails to ensure that we stay in line. It's actually quite fascinating to see the rabbinic laws that were made to prevent certain things from happening and how right and correct they were in instituting those protective fences. I know personally, looking at some of those rabbinic laws, I look at them and say, are you crazy? You really mean to tell me that if X happens, then Y will happen? Like, come on. They're totally disconnected and it would never lead to that. But yet, we are afforded the benefit of history and being able to look back at history and say that Jews that have gotten rid of those rabbinic laws actually began getting rid of those Torah laws as well. And the direct line can actually be traced between the things that the rabbi said we need to preserve and protect, and when those weren't done, exactly what the rabbi said was going to happen happened. So it really is quite fascinating to see the direct correlation between the transgression of rabbinic law and the forgetting and getting rid of the connection to Torah law. But that is a great question. Keep them coming. joydenver.com/Dear Rabbi.